So what happens when a local council knows that children are in danger, but doesn't act? Well, there's this landmark UK Supreme Court case, the Poole Council ruling, that totally changed the game on that very question. Let's break down exactly how it did that. All right, let's just get right to the heart of it with this one massive question. Can you actually sue a council for negligence if they fail to protect a child they know is being harmed? You'd think the answer would be a simple yes, right? But for a very, very long time, the answer was, well, it was incredibly complicated. So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll talk about what a council's duty is supposed to be. Then we'll get into the actual story of the Poole case. And it's a tough one. We'll look at this decades-old legal barrier that was in the way. And then, the big moment, the Supreme Court's verdict. And finally, we'll wrap up with why this ruling is such a big deal even today.
Okay, first things first. To really get what's going on in this case, we have to understand the core legal idea that's underneath all of it. And that is, what is the duty of a public body?
So the key term here is duty of care. Now, that's just a legal way of saying you have a responsibility to not cause harm that you could reasonably see coming. Think about it like this. A lifeguard at a swimming pool, they have a super clear duty of care for everyone in the water. No question. But here's the million-dollar question, the big legal gray area. When does a council's social services department have that same kind of direct duty to protect one specific child? Okay, let's move away from the legal jargon for a minute and talk about the human story at the center of this legal earthquake. Because this isn't just about abstract principles, you know? This is about a real family and their absolutely devastating struggle. And the facts of this case, they're really tough to hear. Basically, Poole Council housed a mother and her two kids, one of whom had severe disabilities, right next door to a family they knew had a history of terrible antisocial behavior. For years, not months, years, these kids were subjected to just relentless harassment and abuse. And the council, they were told about it over and over again. They did some investigations, they monitored it, but, and this is a critical part, they never actually removed the children from that horrible situation. The result was, predictably, severe psychological harm. Now, listening to that, you'd think, okay, that's an open and shut case of failure, right? But that's the thing. Legally, it wasn't that simple at all. This family was up against a legal barrier that had been in place for decades, and it was a huge obstacle in their fight for accountability. And their journey through the courts was just a long, hard slog. Their first claim, it was thrown out by the High Court. So they appealed, and they lost again at the Court of Appeal. Both times, the courts were following this old, established legal rule that pretty much protected the council. Their one final shot, their last hope, was the Supreme Court. So what was this giant legal barrier? Well, for decades, the rule was basically this. Just because a council is investigating or monitoring a child situation, that doesn't mean it automatically takes on a specific legal duty of care, the kind you can be sued over. It's almost like the law was saying they could have a front row seat to the problem, but couldn't be held responsible for not stopping it. And that was the legal brick wall this family kept running into. But then, in 2019, everything changed. The case finally made it to the UK's highest court, and what happened next was a truly landmark shift in the law. The verdict was so clear and so powerful. It was a unanimous decision. Let that sink in. All 5 Supreme Court justices ruled in favor of the children. They said their case could go forward. Just like that, the legal barrier that had stood solid for decades, it was completely shattered. And this was the fundamental change. The law literally flipped. It went from a starting point of investigating doesn't create a duty to a whole new standard, that a council can assume a responsibility based on what it does. Now, I know that might sound like a small change in wording, but believe me, the impact of that shift is absolutely massive. In fact, Lord Reed, who's the president of the Supreme Court, he put it perfectly in the judgment. He said, the real question is, and I'm quoting here, whether the council had assumed a responsibility to protect them from that harm by its words or conduct. So you see, the test wasn't just about what the council's powers were on paper anymore. It was about whether their actual actions, what they said and did, meant they'd effectively taken on the job of protecting those kids. And this all comes down to a crucial new legal test called assumption of responsibility. It basically means we have to ask, okay, what did the council actually do here? Did their actions, their involvement, create a situation where it was totally reasonable for that family to rely on them for protection? And in the Poole case, the Supreme Court said, yeah, it's absolutely possible that they did. So let's step back from the legal details for a second. What does all this actually mean in the real world? Why is this one ruling so important for children and for public services all across the country?
Well, let's break down the practical effects. First, and this is huge, it opens the door for other children who have been harmed by a council's negligence to actually seek justice. Second, it gives everyone a much clearer legal test to work with, that whole assumption of responsibility idea. And third, and this is really important, it didn't open the floodgates for lawsuits that some people worried about. This doesn't mean councils are suddenly liable for every single mistake. It only applies in those specific situations where they've actively taken on that responsibility.
And you have to remember, we're not talking about ancient history here. This all went down in 2019. It's a really recent and honestly a pretty radical change that threw out decades of previous law. We're probably still seeing the full effects of it unfold, even today.
So if you take one thing away from this whole story, let it be this. The Poole ruling completely shifted the legal focus. It stopped being about just asking what a council must do on paper and started being about what a council chooses to do and the serious responsibilities that come along with those choices.
And that leaves us with one last really big question, doesn't it? The Poole ruling created a clear path to hold councils accountable, which is a massive step. But that legal clarity shines a bright light on a much bigger problem for all of us. If we're going to expect councils to meet this incredibly important responsibility, how do we make sure they actually have the money, the people, and the resources to get the job done?